What if the real horrors of ancient ritual didn't happen in temples or altars, but in the heart of a living forest that watched everything in silence? Imagine standing at the edge of a clearing where the trees feel older than time itself, where the air thickens, and where every instinct in your body whispers that you should turn back. Now imagine being one of the ritual prisoners, blindfolded, bound, and forced to walk deeper into a darkness that even the Druids' own followers feared to enter. What would you do if the very people who claimed to protect the natural world believed that sacrificing you was the only way to keep it alive? For centuries, the Druids have been romanticized as wise philosophers, peaceful mystics, guardians of knowledge. But beneath the poetic stories told by bards and medieval chroniclers lies something far more disturbing. There were rituals so secretive, so unnervingly precise, that even those allowed to witness them were left trembling. Some walked away, questioning their faith. Others never walked away at all. And at the center of these rituals were the forest priests, the elite among Druids, men and women who believed the trees themselves demanded obedience, offerings, and sometimes blood. As you step into this story, picture the scene through the eyes of the prisoners. The soft moss under your feet, the faint smell of damp earth, the distant sound of chanting echoing between ancient oaks. You know something is waiting for you, but you don't know what. The Druids believed the forest was a living spirit with desires, moods, and a temper that needed taming. And to them, you were not a person anymore. You were an offering, a vessel, a necessary surrender to forces older than human memory. The question is not whether the rituals were real. The question is whether you're ready to understand what those rituals meant. To the Druids, to their followers, and to the victims who vanished beneath the canopy. As this opening unfolds, think about something essential. Why were these rituals hidden from their own people? Why did the witnesses swear vows of silence so severe that breaking them meant exile, or worse? And what kind of power could inspire such fear that entire tribes obeyed without question? What you will uncover here might challenge everything you thought you knew about ancient spirituality. The deeper we go, the more sinister the truth becomes, and the more the forest itself begins to feel like a character, watching, waiting, remembering. Before we descend further into the shadows, tell me something. Have you ever sensed that certain stories were buried on purpose, meant to be forgotten? What you are about to discover may surprise you in ways you don't expect. Leave a comment, sharing your first impression of this opening, and tell me if this kind of hidden history resonates with you. And make sure to like this video and check whether you're already subscribed, because understanding this content is crucial as we unravel what really happened deep inside those sacred woods. Now, let's follow the path just a little further, where the branches begin to close in, and the truth starts to take shape. The deeper you move into that ancient woodland, the more the ground itself begins to feel alive, as if every root beneath your feet is listening. To understand what the prisoners would face, you first have to understand the Druids themselves, not the softened, romanticized figures found in modern storytelling, but the real order that shaped tribes, kings, and entire belief systems. These were not merely wise sages sitting around fires predicting omens. They were lawmakers, judges, executioners, and spiritual engineers who believed that the balance of the world depended on their rituals. To defy them was to defy nature itself. And in the societies they ruled, nature was the highest authority imaginable. Most followers never saw the rituals that maintained this cosmic order. They only saw the consequences. A failed harvest meant the spirits were displeased. A sudden sickness meant the forest demanded recompense. A birthmark on a newborn meant an ancient curse had awakened. In every scenario, the tribes turned to the Druids for answers, and the Druids always had one. Their power did not come from swords or armies, but from fear disguised as wisdom. They read meaning in the rustling of leaves, in the movement of crows, in the shape of smoke rising from sacred fires. And because no one else could interpret these signs, no one questioned what the Druids decided must be done. Imagine being a follower, loyal but uncertain, standing outside the circle of stones where the leaders gathered. You hear murmurs of the old rites, whispers about offerings that once appeased the spirits when disaster threatened. People speak of the forest as if it feels hunger, as if it remembers past betrayals. When the Druids walked among their people, they were treated with a respect so intense it bordered on fear. Eyes lowered, voices softened. Children were taught never to cross their path, never to ask questions, never to doubt. Doubt, after all, was dangerous. Doubt meant imbalance, and imbalance meant something, someone, would eventually pay for it. For the Druids, ritual prisoners were not criminals. They were instruments, chosen figures selected with a precision that seemed almost scientific. Sometimes they were captives from rival tribes, sometimes outcasts, sometimes chosen because an oracle claimed the forest had spoken a name in the wind. The logic was always hidden behind layers of symbolic meaning, and no one dared to argue, because the Druids were believed to wield the kind of knowledge that could unravel the world if mishandled. They knew which trees were sacred, which animals carried messages, which nights were thin enough for spirits to cross into the mortal realm. So, when the Druids announced that the forest required a sacrifice, no follower refused. No warrior raised a blade to resist. Even those who feared the rituals accepted them, because the alternative, drawing the forest's wrath, seemed unthinkable. These were people who lived and died by superstition, by omens, by the invisible currents of a world they believed was constantly watching. And in such a world, the prisoners walking into the woods were not simply victims. They were offerings meant to protect the tribe, to restore balance, to keep the unseen forces satisfied. What they were about to endure was justified not by cruelty, but by the belief that the survival of the entire community depended on it. And with that belief carved into every mind, the prisoners' fate had already been sealed long before they reached the clearing where the thick canopy swallowed the light. The prisoners chosen for the ritual rarely understood why they had been selected, and even if they asked, the Druids never offered explanations. To the victims, it felt arbitrary. To the Druids, it was destiny unfolding with mathematical precision. Once chosen, the prisoners were isolated from the rest of the tribe, placed under the watch of silent guardians painted in ash and ochre. Their bodies were washed, not out of kindness, but to purify them before entering the sacred forest. Every step they took from that moment on was part of a sequence the Druids believed must unfold, exactly as the ancestors had commanded. Any hesitation was met with firm hands, but no words, because words carried power, and were only spoken when ritual demanded it. The path they walked was narrow, almost deliberately constricted by the forest itself. Branches interlocked overhead like ribs forming a cage, and the air grew colder as they advanced. The forest was not merely a place, it was a presence. The Druids believed the trees listened, absorbing the thoughts and fears of anyone who dared to pass. For the prisoners, that belief became suffocating. They were told nothing about what awaited them, only that resisting would. anger forces older than humankind. Many tried to steady their breathing, but the sound of ritual drums faintly echoing from deeper within the woods made their hearts race faster. It felt as though each beat matched the pounding in their chests. Followers of the Druids who lived near these woods sometimes whispered about what they had glimpsed: a procession of hooded figures guiding trembling captives along hidden trails. Children were warned never to wander too far, because they might cross paths with these ritual columns. Even loyal believers feared encountering them, afraid the forest would mistake their presence as an offering. Stories circulated about shadows that followed the processions, shapes moving parallel to the prisoners, silent, watchful, impossible to explain. Some said the spirits of previous sacrifices lingered among the trees, curious about those who would soon join them. As the prisoners continued their forced march, subtle details changed around them. The ground became softer, absorbing sound. The trees grew thicker, their bark carved with runes that glowed faintly when touched by the moonlight. Insects fell silent. No birds called. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The Druids believed this silence marked the threshold between the mortal world and the realm where the forest gods listened more closely. For the prisoners, it marked the moment they realized escape was no longer possible. Every direction looked the same, and the cloaked guardians seemed to anticipate even the slightest movement, tightening their grip whenever a captive hesitated. Some prisoners cried. Others prayed to gods the Druids forbade. A few simply stared forward, resigned, as though the forest had already drained the strength from their bones. But what all of them felt, what every one of them remembered, until their final breath, was the moment the path opened into a circular clearing. Torches lined the perimeter, placed at exact intervals. At the center stood a wooden structure shaped like a spine rising from the earth. Standing before it, waiting in absolute stillness, were the forest Druids. Their faces masked, their robes patterned with symbols that pulsed in the shifting firelight. It was here that the prisoners understood they had reached the point of no return, where the forest would decide what pieces of them it wanted to keep. The clearing was not a simple gathering place. It was an operating chamber of belief, engineered across generations. Every object, every symbol, every shadow had a purpose. As the prisoners were pushed forward, they noticed markings carved into the soil, spirals, intersecting lines, and sigils arranged in patterns too precise to be random. To the untrained eye, these shapes looked decorative, but to the Druids they were conduits, channels for forces the forest held but rarely revealed. When the captives stepped across them, it felt like stepping over thresholds that separated their previous lives from what awaited them. The forest Druids moved in synchronized silence, their robes whispering against the ground. Some carried staffs adorned with feathers and bones. Others held bowls filled with thick black resin that burned with a scent sharp enough to sting the back of the throat. The prisoners were positioned at the edges of the clearing, while the Druids began their preparations. They traced symbols on their own arms, on stones placed intentionally around the ritual space, and finally onto the prisoners themselves. The touch was cold, deliberate, almost clinical. Whatever the substance was, it left marks that shimmered faintly under the torchlight, as if reacting to the very air. Witnesses from the tribes were rarely allowed to attend, but when they were, they stood far behind the masked Druids, trying not to breathe too loudly. Even they did not know what every symbol meant. They only understood that these markings represented vows, commitments extracted from the spirits, the earth, and the sacrifice itself. Breaking these vows invited consequences the Druids claimed would ripple through families for generations. It was this kind of fear that kept followers obedient, even when they sensed something was terribly wrong. The prisoners, meanwhile, were subjected to strict silence. Their voices were forbidden, not because their words lacked meaning, but because sound itself was part of the ritual. The Druids believed human speech could disrupt the delicate balance they were constructing. Instead, only the forest voices were allowed. The rustling of leaves, the crackle of resin flames, the low hum of wind threading between ancient branches. These natural sounds were considered sacred signals, responses from forces unseen. When the trees groaned, or when a sudden breeze circled the clearing, the Druids leaned forward, interpreting these movements as messages only they could understand. One of the most unsettling parts of this stage was the mask ceremony. The prisoners were forced to kneel while the Druids placed wooden masks over their faces. These masks were crudely carved but deeply symbolic. Each represented a spirit, an element, or a creature believed to inhabit the forest's hidden pathways. To the Druids, masking the prisoners stripped them of individual identity and prepared them to become vessels. To the prisoners, it meant suffocation, disorientation, and terror amplified by every breath echoing inside the wooden shell. Once masked and marked, the captives were guided into the center of the circle one at a time. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the earth resisted their presence. The air thickened with the burning resin, and the hum of chantless ritual grew more intense. The guardians surrounding them tightened the perimeter, ensuring there was no path back into the forest. The prisoners could feel eyes on them, human eyes, masked eyes, and something else watching from between the trees. Everything that happened next depended on how the forest responded to these preparations. The Druids claimed they could feel shifts beneath the soil, hear whispers carried in the wind, sense signals that determined which prisoner would be accepted and which would be rejected. Whatever fate the forest chose, the prisoners would soon discover it in the most brutal way imaginable. If you've followed the path this far, tell me in the comments. What do you think these symbols and silent vows were truly meant to protect, or conceal? Your thoughts might reveal more about this ritual world than the Druids ever intended to share. The transition from preparation to offering happened so subtly that the prisoners often didn't realize the shift until they were already in the grip of the ritual. Once the Druids determined the forest had accepted their signs, they began guiding the chosen captive toward the structure at the center of the clearing. It stood taller up close, woven from branches that looked as though they had grown together rather than been constructed by human hands. Some prisoners believed the structure moved when they approached, as if adjusting itself in anticipation. Whether it was an illusion formed by fear or something far older rising to meet them, no one could ever say with certainty. The Druids handled the prisoners with an unsettling mixture of gentleness and purpose. They weren't rough or frantic. Their movements were practiced, almost reverent, as if they were preparing a sacred artifact rather than a living human being. The mask on the prisoner's face amplified every breath, every twitch, every small sound trapped behind its wooden surface. From within that carved shell, the world felt distorted, distant, muffled, but alarmingly intimate at the same time. The prisoner could hear their own heartbeat louder than the chants beginning to form around them. Those chants were not words, but tones, layered vibrations rising in slow increments. It was a language made from breath and rhythm rather than syllables, and as it intensified, the air around the clearing seemed to thicken. Witnesses later described feeling pressure in their skulls and chest, like standing beneath the weight of a storm about to break. The Druids believed these tones opened a channel between the living world and the unseen forces housed within the forest's deepest roots. Whether those forces existed or not, the effect on the prisoners was undeniable. Their bodies reacted with trembling, dizziness, even hallucinations as the sound wrapped around them. The structure they were led to had a hollow center lined with twisted vines, still pulsing faintly with sap. The Druids believed the vines were alive in ways that transcended normal growth, extensions of the sacred trees that encircled the clearing. The prisoner was positioned inside it, their arms bound to wooden supports, their legs tethered to roots protruding from the ground. Once secured, the Druids began coating the structure with the black resin from earlier. Its scent grew stronger, acrid enough to sting the eyes even through a mask. When it ignited, it did not burn like ordinary fire. It smoldered, creating columns of dense smoke that moved as though guided by invisible currents. The smoke played a crucial role in the ritual. As it rose, the Druids circled the prisoner with slow, deliberate steps, dragging carved staves across the earth in patterns that disrupted the soil. Lines shifted, symbols distorted, spirals widened or tightened depending on how the smoke behaved. To the Druids, the movement of the smoke was an omen that revealed what sacrifice was required, whether the forest needed life, memory, confession, or transformation. Each of these demanded a different sequence of actions, some of which only the most senior members of the order were permitted to perform. Meanwhile, the prisoner felt the warmth of the smoldering resin seep into the structure, making the vines expand and tighten like muscles responding to heat. Many captives tried to lean away, only to find the vines flex subtly, pulling them back, holding them upright. The Druids insisted the vines were responding to the will of the forest, not to human manipulation. Whatever the truth, the sensation of being gripped by something both plant and animal left the prisoners in a state of terror beyond reason. As the ritual deepened, the chants shifted again, becoming lower, more resonant. The perimeter guardians struck the torches with their staves, sending sparks flying upward, where they hovered longer than they should have before fading. Followers who witnessed this swore they saw shapes appearing in the smoke, figures forming momentarily before dissolving, as though the forest was peering through a veil. The prisoner felt the world around them blur, not because of pain, but because the ritual had entered the stage where the forest was believed to judge the offering. And once that judgment was made, the Druids would act accordingly, swiftly, precisely, and without hesitation, because in their eyes the prisoner had already crossed the boundary between person and vessel long before stepping into that clearing. At the heart of the clearing stood the tree sanctuary, a living construct the Druids regarded as the ritual's nucleus. Its trunk was impossibly wide, twisted with age, and entwined with the roots and branches of smaller trees as if nature itself had bent to create a sacred column. The prisoners, still bound and masked, were guided to its base by the Druids, whose hands moved with ritual precision. To the uninitiated, it looked like an ordinary tree, but to those trained in Druidic knowledge, every knot, every scar in the bark, every branching limb was a symbol, a channel, a vessel of the forest's will. Here, in the shadow of that sanctuary, human offerings were transformed into conduits of power. The prisoners were positioned against the tree, their bodies pressed gently but firmly against the rough bark, which had been polished in places to reveal intricate carvings. Some carvings were so old that the wood had nearly closed over them, yet their meaning remained potent. Spirals, triangles, and shapes that no human eye could fully decipher. The Druids began tracing their staves along these patterns, connecting the carvings with slow, deliberate motions, as if drawing energy from the earth itself. The prisoners could feel subtle vibrations through their feet, pulses that seemed to resonate with the rhythm of the Druids' movements. The forest was no longer just around them. It was within them. Above, the canopy filtered the moonlight, scattering beams that landed like luminous threads across the clearing. The Druids' chants began to rise again, lower this time, almost imperceptible at first, then swelling into a resonance that seemed to press against the prisoners' chests. They called it the breath of the forest, a sound that could only be truly heard when every step, every heartbeat was aligned with the ancient pattern. Even masked, the prisoners felt the intensity of this energy. The air grew thicker, the scent of resin burning richer, and the temperature fluctuated as though the sanctuary itself breathed with anticipation. The tree sanctuary was not merely symbolic, it responded. Branches shifted subtly, leaves rustled without wind, and roots seemed to tighten around the base, as though testing the will of the living vessels pressed against them. The Druids moved closer, each step measured, each gesture precise. They touched the prisoners lightly, tracing glyphs across their skin, leaving markings that glowed faintly under the moonlight. To an observer, these motions were ceremonial. To the victims, they were intrusive, penetrating, and unyielding, embedding fear and awe simultaneously. Every movement was a preparation for the next phase, a phase that would blend the boundary between life and the forest's perceived demands. The air grew thick with incense derived from rare herbs, their pungent aroma masking fear but amplifying hallucination. Shadows moved across the clearing, elongated and distorted by the flickering torches. The Druids' chants took on a rhythm that felt almost alive, a rhythm that seemed to breathe with the forest itself. Some prisoners began to feel their bodies heavy, their minds disconnected from the surrounding world, slipping into a state where perception and reality intertwined. They could feel the presence of watchers, those who had come before, those whose lives had been claimed, their energy lingering, almost tangible, like threads connecting the sanctuary to the living and the dead. At this moment, the tree sanctuary became the axis around which the ritual turned. It was no longer simply a tree. It was a living instrument, a focal point for the Druids' mastery over belief, fear, and nature itself. The prisoners realized, consciously or not, that they were part of something greater than themselves, a process older than tribes, older than their own lifetimes. The forest, through its Druids, demanded absolute compliance, and in this sanctuary, the line between sacrifice and transformation blurred. Every breath, every tremor, every heartbeat aligned with the sanctuary's rhythm, preparing the prisoners for a trial that was as much spiritual as it was terrifying. As night deepened, the clearing transformed into a shadowed theater of ancient power. The Druids moved in near silence, their chants now replaced by subtle gestures that seemed to communicate directly with the tree sanctuary. The prisoners, still bound and masked, could feel every movement as though the forest itself pressed against their skin. The air grew thick with anticipation, and even the sounds of nocturnal creatures seemed to pause, as if acknowledging that something sacred and terrible was unfolding. Every footstep of the Druidic guardians was calculated, each movement an extension of the ritual's intricate choreography. The assistants to the forest priests had roles just as critical. Cloaked figures slipped silently between the torches and the prisoners, adjusting bindings, applying markings, and whispering untranslatable words that seemed to echo within the mind rather than the ears. These initiates had been trained for years to anticipate the forest's reactions, to read the subtle signs in smoke, flame, and the shiver of leaves. They moved with a precision that made it impossible for the prisoners to resist, impossible to predict what would happen next. Every adjustment, every touch, reinforced the message. They were no longer autonomous beings, but conduits for forces they could not begin to understand. The forest itself became a character in the ritual. Branches arched as though reaching toward the ritual center, leaves glimmering faintly with dew that reflected the torchlight. The prisoners felt the vibrations of the ground through their feet and the pressure of unseen eyes from the darkness beyond the clearing. Occasionally, a sudden gust of wind would sweep through, extinguishing some torches and sending shadows twisting like serpents across the circle. The Druids responded immediately, their staves tracing arcs that seemed to stitch the shadows back into place, maintaining the structure of the ritual and reinforcing the authority of the forest over the captive souls. Inside this heightened reality, the role of the forest's acolytes was to maintain order, to ensure that the flow of fear, awe, and compliance remained uninterrupted. They whispered warnings, guided bodies, adjusted positions, all without breaking the rhythm of the sanctuary. Even a single misstep could disrupt the perception of the forest's will, weakening the spell that bound the prisoners' minds to the Druidic design. Every movement was deliberate, a lesson in the precision of control that the Druids wielded as easily as breath. And then came the first signs of transformation. The Maibi prisoners began to perceive a shift, subtle but undeniable. Their fear became layered with confusion, their senses heightened yet distorted. Shadows seemed to cling to their limbs. The scent of burning resin filled their lungs, mingling with the metallic tang of sweat and terror. Some began to mutter beneath their masks, involuntarily, words the Druids later claimed were echoes of the forest's own voice. The assistants watched for these moments, noting which prisoners faltered, which resisted, and which began to merge their awareness with the rhythm of the ritual. By the deepest hours of night, the forest and the tree sanctuary had fully assumed command over the clearing. The prisoners were no longer individuals. They were elements within a living system, each heartbeat synchronized to the drum of unseen forces. Observers who survived to recount the event later described a hush that fell over the forest itself, a silence so complete that it felt like the world had paused in reverence or dread. It was at this point, when the veil between human perception and the forest's will seemed thinnest, that the assistants whispered to those still able to hear, "Remember what you witness. What unfolds here cannot be undone, and it cannot be spoken of lightly." If you felt chills reading this, leave a comment describing your reaction. Which part of this secretive night terrifies you the most? And what do you think the Druids intended for the prisoners in these shadows? Your insight could reveal interpretations that the forest itself might recognize. As dawn approached, the clearing remained suspended between shadow and light, a space where time itself seemed to bend. The prisoners, exhausted and disoriented from the night's events, were guided toward the outskirts of the tree sanctuary. The Druids no longer needed to touch them. Their presence alone, their silent authority, was enough to maintain compliance. Every step the captives took was measured and deliberate, as though the forest itself continued to guide them along a path already chosen. The air was thick with a mixture of smoke, dew, and the lingering energy of ritual, making each breath feel like both a relief and a weight upon the chest. The aftermath of the ritual was not immediate. The forest demanded that the prisoners remain within the clearing for hours, sometimes longer, until the Druids were certain the energies had been fully absorbed. Some captives swayed, unsteady on their feet, their eyes behind the masks wide with fear and wonder. The assistants moved among them like shadows, offering water, adjusting bindings, and watching for any sign of resistance. Every action was precise, intended to reinforce the forest's power and remind the prisoners that their bodies and minds were no longer solely their own. It was a transition period, a liminal space between the terror of the ritual and the consequences that would follow. The Druids themselves were silent, standing in deliberate patterns around the clearing, their faces hidden beneath masks that echoed the ancient spirits. They observed the prisoners with an intensity that went beyond human scrutiny, as though they were scanning the very soul. To an outsider, it might have seemed ceremonial or even meditative, but for those bound to the tree sanctuary, it was suffocating. Each heartbeat echoed in their ears, each tremor in the ground seemed magnified, and the forest seemed to pulse in tandem with their own fear. The lessons of the night, the demonstration of control, the power of obedience, the fusion of human and forest, were still unfolding silently within them. Even after the formal ritual ended, the forest's influence lingered. The prisoners reported feeling a subtle pull, a direction toward the tree that refused to let them entirely leave. Their minds were filled with fragmented visions of past sacrifices, whispers from the foliage, and fleeting shapes that appeared in the corner of their eyes. Some believed the forest communicated with them directly, implanting suggestions, warnings, or fragments of memory that did not belong to their own experience. The Druids encouraged this perception, allowing the captives to dwell in it, knowing that prolonged immersion would deepen the psychological imprint of the ritual. Outside observers, loyal followers who had been instructed to wait at the perimeter, witnessed strange phenomena. Shadows flickered unnaturally, mist coiled around the roots like living snakes, and faint sounds, neither animal nor human, echoed through the clearing. Even the air felt alive, vibrating with a frequency that unsettled the senses. The Druids claimed this was the forest speaking, a confirmation that the ritual had been accepted and that the prisoners had become integrated into its unseen network. To the captives, it was disorienting, frightening, and inescapable. They could no longer distinguish their own thoughts from the subtle influence of the Ebi-On ritual, and by the time they were allowed to leave the clearing, each step forward was weighted with the invisible chains of the forest's will. As the prisoners were finally released from the immediate vicinity of the tree sanctuary, they did not return to their previous lives unchanged. Every movement, every thought, and every decision carried the imprint of the ritual. They would speak of little when recounting it, for the Druids had ingrained in them the idea that some knowledge was too dangerous to share. And yet, in the quiet corners of the forest and the deepest recesses of memory, the echoes of that night remained, shaping perceptions, allegiances, and the fragile understanding of what had truly occurred beneath the ancient canopy. The weeks that followed the ritual revealed its true impact, not only on the prisoners, but on the order itself. Within the Druidic hierarchy, the aftermath was carefully observed and recorded, though never in writing that outsiders could understand. The forest was said to demand proof that its will had been carried out, and the priests evaluated the psychological and spiritual consequences with a precision that rivaled any scholar's assessment. Each prisoner's behavior, each whisper of fear or obedience, was a data point in a system designed to refine the rituals and ensure the forest's influence remained absolute. Those who faltered or displayed resistance were marked, their fates often sealed in ways that would remain hidden from the general populace. The survivors of the ritual returned to their tribes physically intact, but spiritually altered. They carried with them the invisible imprint of what had been done to them, a constant reminder of their vulnerability and of the forest's omnipotence. Some developed an acute sensitivity to the woods, sensing the subtle changes in light, the vibration of roots beneath the soil, or the faint resonance of wind through the branches. Others withdrew, haunted by images and sensations they could neither explain nor share. The Druids considered these reactions necessary. A lasting impression ensured that the lessons of the ritual would permeate beyond the clearing, influencing behavior, reinforcing hierarchy, and instilling obedience. Within the Druidic order, the ritual served multiple functions. It was not only a means of appeasing the forest or demonstrating control, but also a method of consolidating power. The hierarchy relied on secrecy and fear, and the knowledge that such rituals occurred was itself a tool. Those who bore witness to its results, apprentices, assistants, and lower-ranked priests, understood that the forest demanded compliance, and that deviation was dangerous. This fear became a stabilizing mechanism, ensuring that the order maintained cohesion even in times of internal dispute or external threat. In this way, the ritual extended far beyond the immediate clearing, shaping social and spiritual structures across the territory. The political consequences were equally significant. Tribes aligned themselves with Druidic authority not only out of reverence, but out of recognition that the forest's power and its unpredictable judgment could shift the balance of life and death. Leaders who sought to resist or undermine the Druids were carefully monitored, often subtly manipulated to experience the ritual's psychological echoes, reinforcing loyalty and submission without overt coercion. The forest's influence, transmitted through the mechanisms of ritual and fear, became a governing force, both spiritual and secular. In the shadows of the forest, these practices created a network of dependency. Communities learned that protection and prosperity were contingent upon obedience, and the memory of the ritual lingered in oral histories, warnings, and hushed conversations. Even generations later, descendants could sense the forest's presence, and the unseen structures of control imposed by the Druids persisted. This way, the rituals were not merely isolated acts of sacrificial ceremony, but integral to the ongoing maintenance of power, identity, and spiritual authority within the ancient world. And though the immediate horrors were contained within the clearing, the psychological imprint of the forest's will spread far and wide, a reminder that those who entered its sacred heart were never truly free again. The final moments of the ritual left an indelible mark not only on the prisoners, but on the forest itself, as if the clearing had absorbed the tension, the fear, and the devotion into its very soil. The Druids stepped back, silent and deliberate, allowing the forest to reclaim its presence over the site. The prisoners, their bodies exhausted and minds frayed, were guided toward the perimeter, yet something had shifted within them. They had become more than witnesses. They were carriers of the forest's authority, vessels through which the unseen forces had communicated. Every breath, every heartbeat, carried a residue of what had transpired, a connection to a cycle that the forest demanded continue beyond the visible. As the captives left the tree sanctuary, the forest seemed to hold its breath. The rustle of leaves and the distant cries of nocturnal creatures no longer felt ordinary. The Druids had completed a transformation that few outside the order could comprehend. Observers, whether young initiates or loyal followers, witnessed a subtle but profound change in the prisoners. Their demeanor, their posture, their very presence now communicated a mix of awe and submission. The forest had not merely accepted them, it had inscribed its influence into the core of their being. Even the Druids recognized that some lessons were irreversible. Once the forest's will had entwined itself with human consciousness, there was no erasing its memory. In the days that followed, the survivors moved through the lands with a quiet gravity. Their actions, their decisions, even their whispered words reflected a newfound understanding of authority and consequence. For the Druids, this was the ultimate confirmation of success. The forest's commands had been carried out without question, and the psychological imprint of the ritual had reinforced both obedience and reverence. Stories of the clearing, while never shared openly, spread in coded forms among the tribes, embedding a culture of respect, fear, and cautious devotion. The unseen consequences of the ritual extended far beyond the immediate participants, shaping social structures, governance, and the spiritual alignment of the communities. For anyone who has journeyed through this narrative, the power of these ancient practices may seem both fascinating and terrifying. And it's precisely this combination that draws us into history's hidden corridors, the places where belief, fear, and authority intertwine in ways few dare to acknowledge. The rituals of the Druids, preserved in whispers, and the faint echoes of the forest serve as a reminder that control over human perception can be as enduring as any physical dominion. They teach us that sometimes the most profound influences are invisible, operating through subtle pressure, expectation, and a carefully cultivated sense of inevitability. If you've followed this story to its final threads, take a moment to leave a comment sharing what struck you the most. Did the forest feel alive to you as it did to the prisoners? Did the rituals seem like acts of devotion, terror, or both? Your insights help uncover dimensions that even centuries of secrecy could not erase. Don't forget to like this video if the depth of these ancient practices fascinated you, and make sure you're subscribed to stay connected with this exploration of history's most hidden truths. There's another video right here that continues to reveal the shadows of ancient orders and secret rites. Click and continue this journey with me, because the story of power, ritual, and the human spirit does not end here.